thank you so much. It's really a pleasure being here today. And I think we're going to pull up my slides here in just a second if we can. Awesome. So, first of all, just to check in where we are. We started the conversation about guiding our growth. We've talked about housing, we've talked about transportation, we've talked about what else did we talk about? Open space, right? And now let's talk about water. We haven't talked about open space yet, but that we're getting there. As was mentioned, I have a dual hat. I am as it says, the executive director of the Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air at Utah State University. As of the last 2 months, I'm also the commissioner of the Great Salt Lake. And I'm here to give you general information on why you should care about the Great Salt Lake. Now, lucky for you, I've prepared 33 slides. And I have exactly 12 minutes and 1 second to do this. So we're going to go fast. First of all, you should care about the Great Salt Lake. There's a lot of reasons to care. First of all, let's talk about where we are. When you look about from space where we have been on the Great Salt Lake over the last 30 or so years, we started at a high point in the mid-1980s, and by 2022, we hit the lowest point that we've ever seen. It's pretty stark. And as we watch that graphic spin through, we realize that there are a variety of consequences that can happen as the Great Salt Lake dries out. One, there's obviously ecological concerns. Two, those ecological concerns then grow into what I would consider aesthetics. It doesn't become as pretty. And then there's also health concerns because you also have increased dust. But both of those things, those ecological concerns and those environmental concerns, actually spiral into something that you all should care about from policymakers in the state. And that is, that can create real policy problems for all of us on how we might manage our water. There's a Goldilocks problems on saline lakes. If you get too much salt in a salty lake, the stuff that relies on the ecosystem there dies. In the Great Salt Lake, we have two things that we're concerned about: brine shrimp and brine flies. And I know that you're not all here because you're worried about the brine shrimp or the brine flies. But here's the thing. Last year, we reached a pretty critical point on the Great Salt Lake to where we were approaching about 18.5, almost 19% salinity. And that's not exact. It's actually measured in parts per liter, but essentially this is where we are. Here's the thing. When you get above about 18 or 19%, brine shrimp and brine flies stop reproducing. And in fact, brine shrimp and brine flies start to die off. And so when we started doing surveys last year on these two things, well, it turns out there was very few of them. Brine shrimp had a bit of a reprieve because we had late summer rains. Those late summer rains came in and created enough fresh water at the top that it removed some of the salinity concerns. But otherwise, people were concerned that those things were going to be done. And why do we care? Well, it turns out animals rely on brine shrimp and brine flies. Yeah, that's an actual picture. That's our state bird, by the way. State bird, of course, the California gull, which for the legislators in the room, I might say, can we have a bird from Utah? Come on. Nonetheless, you can see this dining on a smorgasbord of brine flies. It looks like a really attractive place to visit, right? And other animals rely on brine shrimp. And two of these animals, just brine shrimp and brine flies. The one on the right, or I guess it's the left for you, is an eared grebe. The one on the other side is a Wilson's phalarope. Both of these animals rely almost exclusively on the Great Salt Lake for their survival. And you say, well, great. That would be sad to see them disappear, and I agree it would be sad to see them disappear, but the reality is it would also be a real problem from a policy standpoint. And the problem from a policy standpoint is back in the 1970s, we passed this thing called the Endangered Species Act. And with an Endangered Species Act, we give priority to those animals that are listed. I don't know if there's going to be a listing petition for the eared grebe or the Wilson's phalarope, but that has been discussed in the past. And if that's being discussed, what are the consequences for us? Well, it turns out, not to go into this, but Congress was relatively explicit in the ESA that if a listed species happens, so if a species gets listed, that's going to be the policy priority of the United States to fix. And that's going to take priority over everything else. That's gone all the way to the Supreme Court by people saying, yeah, but you really didn't mean this, right? And in this case, right after they passed the ESA, great case from the Tennessee Valley Authority where there was a fish called the snail darter where they said, you didn't mean us though, right? We put $1 billion into this dam. And the Supreme Court came back and said exactly what they meant was you all. And in fact, you can't construct the dam anymore. True story. And if you look at where that's applied around the state, well, we have examples. The Utah Valley folks can talk about the Utah sucker. Iron County folks can talk about, and Garfield County folks can talk about the impacts of the mammal there, which is the Utah prairie dog. These animals have real consequences for how you can develop and what the resources are available for you to develop in those areas. The other two are on different systems. The small one, that's called the Delta Smelt, which shut down the California Water Project. Just so you know, the transfer of water from the Sacramento Bay Delta into Los Angeles and San Diego. So that's one regulatory concern I think that we need to be aware of. The second I think that you probably are more aware of, and that's the dust problem. As we have had a declining Great Salt Lake, we have exposed more playa. And exposing more playa, then we have, as it weathers over time, more dust. And that dust has, well, two problems. One, it ends up on snowpack. And on ending up on snowpack, it then makes that snowpack melt more quickly. And just be aware that that's a problem because if you look at 2022, there's a recent study that came out that said that snowpack melted a full 2 weeks earlier than it would have otherwise but for the dust off the Great Salt Lake. That should concern you all because that means we're going to have to build more water storage facilities in order to make do. Maybe more at home, though, is that various people also care about the dust and the health concerns. And there's this thing called the Clean Air Act, and I'm sure you're all aware of the Clean Air Act, but it identifies particulate matter at 2.5 and 10 microns as both being bad for your health. And that being the case, well then, we have to be aware of that, and the federal government, through the Clean Air Act, has real regulatory tools, whether they can come in and say, listen, state of Utah or local community, regardless, you really can't do what you're doing, and we have to make this better. So that's something that we have to be aware of and just be mindful of. So I wasn't going to talk about, well, I included the slide before yesterday's lawsuit, but we had a lawsuit yesterday as well, asking a state court to intervene using the public trust doctrine. I'm happy to tell you more about that, but this would essentially give the state courts ability to prioritize how the state utilizes water rights in the state. That's something that will impact all of us in this room if it were to come to be. And then if things get really bad as well, we know the state has tools, and last year Governor Cox issued a proclamation suspending new water diversions in the Great Salt Lake Basin. All of these things create a regulatory environment where we say, well, gosh, we probably need to do something differently. And here's the big question, why is it shrinking? I get asked this every time I do a public presentation. The short answer is we've done a lot of assessment on this. That's the Great Salt Lake elevation since the early 1900s to last year. If you look at precipitation, it's been relatively constant. We have drought, yes, but it's been relatively constant. Mean temperature has been increasing, which means we have more evaporative loss off the lake. And then if you look at the stream flows going into the lake, we have less water coming into the lake. So this is Bear River, which is the largest inflow into the lake. That's the Weber River, second largest. And the third is Jordan. It seems a little less bad, but let's be clear, we're diverting a lot of the Colorado River over through the Central Utah Project and flowing it through Utah Lake. And so it's a little bit artificial in keeping those numbers higher. If you look at who's using the water, well, we have agriculture being number one and municipal and industrial being number two. And that's why we all are in this room talking about this issue. So there's been a lot of talk on Target Lake elevation ranges. In reality, there are better areas and worse areas to be. Where we have been recently in the last 2 or 3 years has been in the areas where we're seeing adverse effects through dust and through those other ecosystem things I was talking about. If we get more water in the lake, we see that in a better range. So my job is to go out and find how we can have more water get into the lake. And this is why we get to the policy options we've got. Here's the problem. I wish I was going to say that this is going to be easy to solve. It is not. All policy options have trade-offs. They have benefits, they have winners and losers. There's no single silver bullet. There's many pieces to the puzzle on how we solve this, and be advised that as we try to solve Great Salt Lake problems, we're also doing this in the context of many other water problems west-wide. And so it's not like, just an example, people say, well, why don't you go out and get more water from the Colorado River? That would be actually a solution, but I'm sure that that would be one of those solutions where you'd have a lot of people concerned about that as well, right? And that may end up being harder than people think. So one option, and this is where you all come here. We're going to have to decide how we grow. And I loved Laura's presentation to where people said we want aggressive conservation measures. I think that oftentimes you hear from those that don't want aggressive conservation measures. I also hear from those individuals, and it's been my experience that people care loudly about the water they have, and that especially they want to put on their yards. That being said, how we grow is going to really determine how much water we have and how much we can grow. And if we have some of those big regulatory triggers out there and say if we don't get it right, well then we have a sledgehammer to come in to fix this, well then all of us are going to be suffering from those choices. And so one of the things that we'd really like to promote is getting close to water neutral growth, to say yes, we can grow, but we have to grow within the means of the water we have available, right? And that's one thing that's going to be hard to do. It's going to be costly, and I understand it. Secondly, as was mentioned, agriculture is a big water user. Also, as Laura mentioned, agriculture has a soft spot in many people's minds. We like agriculture. So when we say let's go out and take all the water from agriculture, that also causes some consternation among the state. But we're going to have to look to see how we can use water more effectively and more efficiently within that agricultural setting. And we've seen some studies that say, hey, if we just use different techniques or apply different crops, or maybe even sometimes ask for deficit irrigation, which is another fancy way to say we fallow land for a time, well, we can actually have pretty significant water savings, and those significant water savings can get us to a point where we don't need to take more drastic remedies. Lastly, and what you're going to see through the legislative session is more policy tools to be able to deliver that saved water from where it is conserved, whether that's in a municipal and industrial setting or within an agricultural setting, to places that might need it more. We're trying to develop more aggressive water markets, as well as trying to make sure that we have, as the state, are able to provide incentives for you all to provide that conservation, and then we get that water to where it needs to be in places like the Great Salt Lake. Here's the take-home message. We can get this right. I have absolute confidence that we can, otherwise I wouldn't have said yes to this job. But my success in saving the Great Salt Lake is determined by your choices in the municipal context and in agriculture choices as well. So I'm asking you all to join us in this. It's worth getting right, because if we don't, we know that there's a big regulatory hammer that's going to smack us all. If we do get it right, we all are able to grow the way we need to grow and do the things we need to do. Thank you so much for your interest and your willingness to participate. Thanks.